one of the most chilling things of this 24 hours is hearing that no matter where you are on this planet, no matter how privileged your society might be, the one thing that is common across the board is domestic abuse. There is no country in the world that doesn't have it hard baked into its cultural attitudes that it is okay somewhere and somehow to harm women in part of a domestic relationship and to harm the children, the family structures that inevitably go with that. Now, it's depressing to have women speaking out about this over and over again when it isn't women, although of course men suffer from violence as well, but it is largely women, and they are the ones trying to solve the problem whilst also being on the receiving end of the problem. But I want you to hear this pre-record that I did with Patrick Stewart. He's a patron of Refuge, and he speaks very candidly about being brought up as a child in a violent relationship and the impact that's had on him as a man, and why he wants men to be part of the solution and not just part of the problem. So have a listen to this. It's thought-provoking in the extreme. I find that in the whole area of the conversations around domestic abuse, which obviously in this period of COVID have spiked horrifically all around the world, but in the main, the people who are talking about it, caring about it, concerned about it, tend to be women, very few men. You became a patron of Refuge many years ago, actually, and I'm wondering what made you decide that you were going to do that and commit yourself to this conversation?
Well, Jude, it happened like this. I grew up when my father returned home from the war. For the first 5 years of my life, from 1940 to 45, were bliss. It was my mother and my brother and myself, and we were very happy. Then my father came home, and he had serious problems. And as time went by, those problems turned into violence, never towards my brother and myself, but always directed at our mother. And we became, which no child should have to do, experts at gauging the temperature of conversations that became disagreements, that became arguments, that became violence. And all we could do, because my father was a very powerful man, was I would go down and insert my body between my mother and my father in order to try to protect her. I never talked about this. I was ashamed and embarrassed, and I was from the time that it all began, because we lived in a working class neighborhood where all the houses were very close together. And so anything that happened in anybody's house could be heard around several other households. So, you know, on the morning going to school after there'd been an ugly fight or a row, we would have police come sometimes, ambulances and so forth. I had never talked about it. I was so ashamed and embarrassed by it, way into my adult life. And then for some reason, I don't quite know why, I think my father had died, and my mother was already gone. And so there was no offense to be given there. So in an interview, I simply very briefly mentioned that I had grown up in a violent home. And then I got a contact from Sandra Hawley, who is the director of Refuge, saying, telling me about Refuge. I'd heard about it, of course, because I lived in Chiswick for years and years and years. And Refuge began life on Chiswick High Road, where they literally took over a house and made it a safe place for women and their children to go. And you'll remember, Sheila, my first wife, we would take things over there, blankets, clothing, foodstuffs, and so forth, and mostly just leave it on the doorstep, because getting into the house was impossible. You'd ring the bell, and then you'd hear bolts being moved and chains and locks being unlocked. And I was so impressed by what Refuge was doing there. Well, it's now a very different organization, as you know, and instead of just having one building, they have many all over the UK. and they're doing extraordinary work. But there has never been a more intense time of women and families needing help than there is today. You're right, the coronavirus and the lockdown situation. I know because my own wife, Sunny, who I think you might have met, we have found, because we're here in the same house, the same rooms, day after day after day after day, tensions are created, you know, and you try to make everything as comfortable and as manageable as possible. But in homes where there are real problems, then of either mental illness or problems about food or income, those cases have soared. So Refuge is under enormous pressure. And whenever Sandra needs any sort of public help or a public voice, I'm not just happy, but I'm immensely proud to be able to speak on their behalf, because the work they do is extraordinary. That's how I came to be involved.
And I think that you're still rare in the sense of a man saying this is something I can own both in my past and in my present commitment. And of course, you've talked about the shame, the taboo, the sense of kind of inadequacy and humiliation that those sort of experiences put on children, and not being able to help, not being able to solve something, not being able to tell anybody. All of this is a terrible cruelty for children. Why do you think that men and boys who are just as likely to have that family experience, even though they might not be as likely to be survivors, they'll still be part of the survival group? Why do you think men and boys don't come out and talk about family violence in the way that women do?
I think, as I've described what happened to me, it is a sense of shame that one's a sense of shame, and also, I must be absolutely frank, a sense of responsibility. When I was a child, I would often blame myself for what was happening at nighttime downstairs while I had been put to bed, as though somehow it was because of me that these things were happening. And in addition, Jude, I know that I have within my own nature what was in my father. I have over the years been able to interpret the feelings that I get, the feelings of anger, the feelings of rage, the feeling of wanting to hurt something or someone. All of those are feelings that I have had. When I first started acting, the one great piece of fakery that I always practiced as an actor was rage. I could never allow myself on stage, mostly, but occasionally in front of the camera, authentically express uncontrollable rage, because I was terrified what would happen if I let it out. So I kept it shut down. But it's there still, Jude. Mm-hmm. I have it. And you know, Sunny, my wife, she knows about it. She is aware of it. And we talk about it a great deal. I have never been violent and harmful to any woman in my life, but the urge sometimes has been there. And it's because of that ongoing understanding of my own nature that I am so grateful to be able to do this work for Refuge, because it acts as a kind of balance in my life. So those men and boys you talk about, I wouldn't be surprised at all if those feelings are not also in them. And they can sometimes be very close to the surface. And it is a frightening and shameful and humiliating experience.
We still have an enormous problem, don't we, right around the world, in accepting that the masculine idea has been a trap in the same way as the feminine idea has been a trap. the strong man, the man who doesn't cry, the man who doesn't get sand kicked in his face, the man whose physicality is, the thing that he strives out with. All of these things are tremendous pressures on boys and then on men. And the thing that, obviously women need and deserve safety. They need and deserve a life that can be independent, where they forge their own future for themselves without in any way it being coerced by a partner. But men obviously need help, they need tools, they need ways of managing this hostility, and also, I suppose, railing against some of the ideas that boys are given, that it's kind of okay to be silent and hostile, that's part of being macho. Do you see many programs in place that are helping boys and men navigate these feelings, some of which are terrifying, that you yourself have had help with?
I don't, Jude, no. I have talked about this with Sandra Hawley, because I know that there are so many men everywhere in the world who do need help with this. Now, some men might privately and exclusively turn to a therapist, or seek counseling, or even practical assistance in dealing with these feelings that they have. Most, I don't think, do. And one of the reasons I've always been grateful to have been an actor is that it is a part of my job to explore carefully all of these feelings which are my own. And then, of course, sometimes I do it in terms of a character. And so the self-analysis process is very, very important, and in the work that I do. And yet I don't think many men, and I'm sure not young men or boys, have access to either the provocation that makes them want to examine what is going on in their heads, in their lives, in their relationships. But I wish there were much more attention being paid to this. And I have discussed this with Sandra. And from time to time, it's rare, very rare, but from time to time, there are men who seek for help from Refuge too, who are themselves the victim in a violent household. But it is extraordinarily rare.
Yeah, I think that boys and men grow up in all societies with a huge amount of fear about violence, and a huge amount of having to displace that fear into other ways of, protecting themselves or holding things at bay. And I think we give very little help to boys and men in the way that you've suggested. And I think also the thing about domestic abuse, even the framing of the word, sounds like, it all happens inside a house. It's the personal responsibility of this dysfunctional couple or family, and they've got to sort of solve it all by themselves. Whereas actually, like other things that we've had to look at in society, it's something that belongs to all of us. It's part of our accepted culture. We're now changing that accepted culture, but it's not changing fast enough. And we find it difficult to own our problems together. But, there's a lot more discussion about it than when I was growing up. There's a lot more owning of it now. Do you think that governments are beginning to feel that it has to be part of health education, mental health education, positive relationship education? Can you see optimism, I suppose, in the way that governments are attending to it?
I have to confess that I'm not aware of that, Jude. In my conversations with Sandra Hawley, I have heard about some of the actions that they are taken. I am not aware at all that governments anywhere are taking responsibility to see that young men, boys, male children are being given help in this respect. Here's something else, which actually I've never talked about, but I was a bully when I was a schoolboy. There was a small band of us who bullied other boys. I went to a co-educational junior school, and actually I can't recall having any relationship with any of the girls in my school at all. But I did bad things when I was 7, 8, 9, 10. I think I began to get a hold on it when I was 11. There was one boy in my class who had a deformed hand. It was just a small lump of flesh with little stubs coming out of it. I don't know why he had that deformity. And we would gather around him and we would punch him and hit him until we made him hit his hand against the stone wall, this deformed hand, until it bled. And then when it bled, we would laugh at him and push him on the floor and run away. I was one of the people who was doing that. But from time to time, I would look over and I would see a master, one of our teachers, who would be aware of what was happening, but never did anything to stop it. So in some sense, there was a silent approval of the kind of bullying that was going on as a boy. And that's where it starts, in children that young. I mean, I was hearing on the radio just now, listening, I'm talking to you from Los Angeles, but I always listen to the 5 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. And the boys the two boys who pushed that boy off the balcony at Tate Modern are being sentenced, I think, today. And, what I did as a boy is not so far removed from what they did. The impact was far, far worse, far greater. But I don't see at the moment any specific objectives that are to help young men. I mean, I think from the age of being young teenagers right up into the late teens and the 20s, when men are beginning to have relationships, mature adult relationships with female partners, that they are in any way being given organized national help to combat their worser instincts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think you're right, and some of the images of leadership we know are incredibly unhelpful, because that we're still having leaders at national level in some countries who openly kind of strut the idea that macho-ness and its
I am presently living in a country that has a president who is a bully. Mm-hmm. We've seen that time and time again in the last 4 years, since 2016. And he is setting an example, Jude. And it's one of the reasons why in the protests that have been happening here as well as in Europe, but on a massive scale here in the United States, in city after city, we have seen bullying as one aspect of those protest marches, only from a minority of young men, but it's evident. You can see it on videos every night.
Yeah. My hope, because I'm a sort of person who likes to think, well, what can we do and how can we make things better, is that although the COVID has revealed these dreadful inequities and intensified inequities, like relationships where the power base is so inappropriate that a partner can feel they can damage another partner both mentally and physically, and that they can own them. My hope is that something about the COVID revelations will mean that collectively we'll say, okay, some things have got to change. Whether they change enough, who knows? But I feel that you and I are having a conversation. We have had this conversation privately between director and actor, years ago, because as you say, as an actor, You have to bring the truth of your experience into the circumstances that you're working in. And that's a very powerful intimacy that the acting profession have with each other, artists have with each other. But I'm feeling as if at least the taboo around domestic abuse has been lifted to a certain extent. You know, people are saying I'm a survivor. People are saying I was a perpetrator. People are saying I was a casualty. I was in the family grouping that was a casualty. And it's always got to be about speaking out, hasn't it? It's always got to be about breaking that moment of silence like you did. And that allows for a huge new set of thoughts to flood into the mind and the heart.
The impact on society is enormous. And the revelations that have come out of some of the research that has been done, that the ones who are at greatest risk, where the numbers are highest, when put in the framework of the population, are African American, people of color, and the yes, I hope it is encouraging an open candor about oneself and one's society. But at the same time, it has been producing these violent reactions in some of these protest marches, and from white supremacist organizations. I had no idea there were so many of them in the United States, but at least there is now a certain amount of exposure. And when the United States has a president and a government which will take these issues seriously and do everything they can to address them along the lines that you have been describing, then we will find that there might become benefits, in fact, from what COVID has done to us.
Yeah, we long for those times. Patrick, perhaps not now, but another time, I'd love to talk to you more extensively about the Othello we did together. That's maybe another whole subject, but just as we finish this interview, I mean, you had this brilliant idea, gosh, how long is it now, 20 years ago that we did it together?
It's over 20 years.
Of an all African-American Othello, where Othello was himself a white man. And that by doing this also photo negative, one could explore the idea of race in Washington, which at that time and still was a hugely divided community. And, you know, when we worked on that together, we had about 24 African-American actors. And I think you were, you and one other were the only white actors. And we had intense and wonderful conversations, as I recall, with these African-American actors who were raging about the fact that, you know, they had so few opportunities to do Shakespeare, they had so few opportunities to be cast in roles that weren't like drug addicts or dealers or whatever. And the audience in Washington at the time for that show had to be sort of rearranged, otherwise they would have all been white, just kind of coming into the theatre as the kind of owners of that theatre. And I'm aware that 20 years later, things have changed a bit, but certainly not enough, not as fast as I would have thought when we did what I think was quite, you know, pioneering work, where we said, you know, we are the minority in this context. Tell us how to make this play.
That certainly was a very potent aspect of our production, and it's very interesting that you should have brought that up, because in these past few days, I have been again in contact with Patrice Johnson, who, as you remember, was our wonderful Desdemona. Patrice and I, we email backwards and forwards and have done for years. But the other day she sent me a photograph that Tegel F. Bougere had sent her of she and I face to face, smiling lovingly at one another. And Michelle Hurd, who is a Black actress here in Los Angeles and is working with me in the new series that I'm shooting, she asked what it was. And I said, well, this was a production, well, I think it was 1998 we did it. with a woman director, which itself was revolutionary, because I think I remember doing some research and finding I couldn't find productions of Othello that had been directed by a woman. So you were breaking ground there. And then the racial transpositions, you know, it became known as the photo-negative Othello. And Michelle Hurd said, I never heard about that production. That's extraordinary. You were doing that work in 1998. Who knows? I didn't know. And it was clearly extraordinary for her. And it made me feel so proud and proud of both of us that we had brought that about. But, you know, looking back now, I believe it was extraordinary what we did. But at the time, it seemed normal and perhaps even a little bit necessary. Well, in order for me to play Othello, we had to make all of these huge adjustments because it was not just about Black prejudice, but about prejudice in any form. And I have the most wonderful memories of that experience.
Yeah, me too.
He the man. You remember that cry that used to go up at the curtain calls?
Absolutely. And I always remember that at least 9 of the actors had played Othello. And so you had about 10 directors. You had me and all the other 9 who played Othello, and they were just as good.
Yes.
You were just as good a director. So, Patrick, thanks so much for your time this afternoon, or this morning, isn't it, Los Angeles? And well, we'll meet again when times allow.
I hope very soon, Jude. Thank you so much for asking me to do this. I'm really delighted and proud to have been part of your 24-hour WOW.
Thank you, Patrick.
Take care, darling. Be safe.
And you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.